We have our webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jennifer Levin, and I'm a grief therapist in Pasadena, California. I'm so honored you've decided to spend a little bit of time with me. Unfortunately, as you know, our current world is filled with a lot of loss, and a lot of different people are experiencing a loved one who has died during this unprecedented time. I decided to develop this webinar to help those of you who are saying goodbye and beginning your grief journey during the midst of this pandemic. I've muted everyone during this presentation, and we are going to have time for question and answers when I'm done afterwards. If you do have questions that arise, please type them in the Q&A box, and my assistant Susanna will either answer them right away or save them for the end of the presentations. So at this point, I'm going to turn off my camera and bring the slides back on, and I look forward to seeing all of you at the very end. Okay, here we go. I want to start us off today by joining together in the purpose of our webinar. Our goal is to learn how to cope and to begin to heal from traumatic grief during COVID-19. Those of you who've been on a webinar with me before know that I like to take a few minutes before we jump into our main content to minimize any distractions that may be in front of you. I invite you to silence your electronics, clear your physical and mental space. This may involve taking some grounding breaths, silencing your computers and phones, shutting your door, or even moving some piles in front of you to create openness and a sense of calm. For those of you who do not know me, let me provide a brief introduction. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist in California, and I specialize in traumatic grief, serious illness, and post-traumatic growth. I have a doctorate in public health from UCLA, and I'm also a recognized fellow in thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement. I have over 25 years experience working in the field of grief and end-of-life care. I'm fortunate to be able to work with my assistant, Winnie, who comes to work with me every day and provides hugs and love to everyone that she meets. This webinar today is part of my new program, From Grief to Growth, an online self-help forum for individuals who have experienced the sudden death or unexpected death of a loved one. From Grief to Growth specializes in providing resources, online classes, and an opportunity for individuals to connect and to begin to heal after traumatic grief. So let's jump in. The mission for today is to help you understand your grief during this unprecedented time, to validate your experiences, and to provide you with the tools and skills that you need to cope with the loss of a loved one during COVID-19. To achieve this mission, we're going to focus on 3 content areas. Specifically, what happens when we cannot say goodbye, when we are not able to engage in rituals of mourning, and we're not fully supported by our family and friends during this time. We're going to review each of these areas and then focus on strategies that you can use to cope. My goal is that after this webinar, you will have a better understanding of what is traumatic grief and how it differs from normal grief. You'll have a better understanding of why all losses during COVID-19 are traumatic, strategies you can use to cope and heal from traumatic grief, and new resources to explore. There's also going to be an opportunity to build a support community and stay connected with others. Now, in an ideal world, when someone we love is dying or has died, we are able to be with them to provide comfort and support as they transition out of this world. This allows us an opportunity to say goodbye either before a death has occurred or shortly after. During this time, many people engage in religious traditions such as prayers or remaining with their loved one for a period of time after death. And also, we join together to mourn and comfort loved ones with rituals that include funerals, memorials, and celebrations of life. When we have the opportunity to engage in these end-of-life practices, we're more likely to experience what is called normal grief. Now, I'm not a fan of the word normal, but it is a way to describe common reactions and responses that we have after the death of a loved one. Despite these commonalities, I do want to emphasize that grief is a highly individualized experience that is impacted greatly by how an individual dies, the relationship we have with the deceased, and the amount of social support and co-occurring stressors in our lives. Normal grief usually involves intense feelings of yearning, pain, sadness, guilt, and even anger. Physical, emotional, spiritual, and social symptoms. Grief attacks, which are intense waves of grief emotions that occur without warning, but do recede. And the ability to reminisce and enjoy memories of your loved ones. With normal grief, the pain does ease over time. You're able to respond to coping mechanisms and perhaps even find meaning in your loss and the ability to integrate your loved one's memories into your life and continue forward. Unfortunately, not everyone experiences normal grief, and for many people, grief is traumatic. For some people, any type of loss is traumatic. However, there are specific characteristics that have been identified that make a loss more traumatic than others. Some of these include an untimely death, a death that is violent, damages our loved one's body, or where our loved one suffers, a death that occurs without warning, a death that can be considered preventable, and a death that is perceived unjust or unfair. When we experience traumatic grief, the survivor has symptoms of trauma that compete with feelings of grief and loss. There tends to be a lot of energy focused on the circumstances related to the death, and this may even overshadow the story of a loved one's life. When traumatic grief is present, we need to focus first on providing stabilization and treating the symptoms of trauma before we can begin to focus on the grief. Some of the symptoms that we need to treat include being hypervigilant, survivors who are constantly in the fight or flight, survivors who are experiencing constant rumination, and other trauma symptoms that are associated with PTSD. In addition, when we experience traumatic grief, the mourner's defenses are often completely overwhelmed. The mourner has a high risk of prolonged grief, complicated grief, and as I just mentioned, PTSD. Thoughts of loved ones are often associated with distressing memories related to how the person died, and it can be very difficult to find meaning and readapt to the world. Right now, people are dying of more than COVID-19. We're still dying of cancer, heart attacks, stroke, accidents, and other medical crises are occurring. While some of these deaths may not usually fit the criteria for being traumatic, during COVID-19, I believe that all deaths should be considered traumatic. One of the first reasons all death is traumatic is because we may not have the opportunity to say goodbye. Saying goodbye is a very important part of grief and healing. Not everyone has a chance to say goodbye to a loved one in person when they die, but there are often indicators that the end is near and we begin to emotionally prepare ourselves for the eventual losses to come. When we say goodbye to someone, it increases the sense of realness, that death is really happening. It also begins the long process of acceptance and starts the grief journey. During COVID-19, a large percentage of people are unable to be with those who are dying. We are unable to travel, we are unable to get close to those that we love, and as a result, unable to say goodbye. In addition to the inability to say goodbye, currently, many of the traditional grief rituals that we use are also not available. We cannot gather to provide comfort and support, and we're unable to have public viewings, memorials, and funerals. There's also not an opportunity to collectively share eulogies and stories. A ritual is a symbolic activity that is performed before, during, or after a meaningful event. Rituals give purpose to our actions and also allow us to connect and be part of something greater than our own solitary selves. We are unable to be with people right now and to perform these rituals. And when we are unable to perform them, we are often left with a sense of emptiness and intense sadness. During the midst of grief, our lives also feel very out of control, and using these rituals can help restore the feeling of control and order from a state of confusion and chaos. Finally, it's important to note that in general, family and friends are not as available or have significant restrictions in their ability to help those who are grieving during this time. Loved ones now have competing needs that they have to juggle, which includes the additional tasks of caring for others, a new work or school routine, and many people are confined to their homes. The traditional bereavement leave offered by work and even society may not be available, and your social support may not be as accessible. I do want to note that some people feel that they are in a protected grief bubble during this time and welcome the comfort of not being able to connect with others as they sit and begin to process their grief. It's also important to note that any losses that occur during COVID-19 are taking place during a pandemic of worldwide grief. Every day on the news, we're surrounded by thousands of people who are dying from this virus. All around us, people are also grieving the everyday changes that have occurred in their life right now. Many people are experiencing a diminished sense of safety, increased anxiety and fear, and a loss of their usual coping mechanisms. Furthermore, many of us are also coping with compounded or cumulative losses that also intensify the grieving experience. So now that we know what we're dealing with, let's focus on ways we can begin to heal from traumatic grief during this unprecedented time. The first thing we need to do is to find a way to say goodbye. It's also important that we acknowledge any pain that we have surrounding these circumstances and relinquish any negative feelings or thoughts we have about ourselves related to not being able to say goodbye. One of my favorite ways to say goodbye is in a letter. Pretend that you are going to have a final conversation with the person you loved. What would you say? How would you communicate how much they meant to you? Would you share some of your favorite memories and how your life is different because they were a part of it? You can choose to keep this letter private or symbolically burn it or share it with family and friends. Other ways to say goodbye include creating time capsule and memory jars where you share the thoughts and feelings of your loved ones. Although traditional grief rituals may not be available right now, there are many new rituals that you can create to honor your loved one. For an example, you can light a candle at a certain time to remind you of your loved one. You can create a memory book of photos, letters, notes, or other significant memorabilia. You can watch a loved one's favorite movie, plant a tree or flowers in their honor. You can also carry a transitional object with you, which you can bring out to remind you of your loved one whenever you need extra comfort. You can cook favorite meals to honor your loved one as well. The good thing about these rituals is you can engage in them during any time or whenever you need some extra comfort or support. Now is also the time to use the amazing technology we have to remember a loved one. It's also a great way to get the younger generation involved in the grieving process as well. These days, you can use platforms like Zoom to come together to engage in joint projects and deliver online eulogies and family gatherings. There are programs available to help you create online memorials, slideshows, and organize your music and playlists that were meaningful to your loved one. Although technology is definitely not the same as in-person interactions, it does provide a temporary forum to begin collectively grieving until the time comes when we can all come together and grieve those that we have lost. It goes without saying that self-care is an essential part of grief during COVID-19. Although self-care is a pillar of any grieving process, I want to point out that it includes more than healthy living activities. It includes having a solid routine and structure to bring consistency and safety to our lives. It also includes being able to identify your needs and ask for help, being able to rely on social support and professional care, and most important during this time, to have self-forgiveness and self-compassion for not being able to be with those that we love. You are unable to control these circumstances, and you need to remind yourself that these things are out of your control. Finally, one of the hallmarks of traumatic grief is that we become focused on the events surrounding the death of the person we loved. I want to stress for a minute how important it is that the way your loved one died and the circumstances surrounding COVID-19 is not a representation of who he or she was or how they lived their life. During this difficult time, make sure you are reflecting on the essence of the person who died. What were their favorite things, their hobbies, their passions, and their joys? What did they care about deeply, and how did they impact those that they love? It can be easy to focus on the things that have made COVID-19 traumatic with those who are experiencing a death. But I invite you to reframe these negative thoughts. Acknowledge the pain and the difficulties surrounding their death, but focus on the positive things surrounding their life. As usual, we have covered a lot of information today in a short time, so let's step back and review. It's my hope that you are taking the following with you after today's webinar. First, that all grief during COVID-19 is traumatic. Second, the lack of end-of-life care and grieving rituals contribute to traumatic grief. Third, the traumatic grieving process differs from normal grief. And fourth, self-compassion and forgiveness is an essential part of self-care right now. Please remember that it's very important to take time to say goodbye. You can use technology to create online memorials and plan family gatherings. It's also important to make plans for memorials and celebration of lives after the risks associated with COVID-19 have decreased. And finally, how a person dies does not represent how they lived. The final portion of this webinar presents some resources related to online memorials, traumatic grief, and free online grief support groups. Tomorrow, you're going to receive a follow-up email from me, which will have a link to all of these resources and their corresponding URLs. The first group of resources are some websites for creating online memorials to bring people together to share memories and stories about your loved one. Most of these sites are free, and the second one, Smilebox, helps you create a memorial slideshow. Next are some free grief groups that you can access online right now. David Kessler has several grief groups available, along with Adventist Health Glendale and their Beyond Loss program. In the next slide, I'm also going to tell you about my free grief group. Finally, there are some books I highly recommend. One of my favorites is the book, I Didn't Get a Chance to Say Goodbye, and my clients really like the book On Grief and Grieving by Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. There's also a post-traumatic growth workbook for anyone who's interested in learning more about this topic. Before we move on to questions and answers, I'd like to share some additional support available to you after this webinar presentation. As I said, tomorrow you'll receive a follow-up email with all of the resources. You'll also get a replay and a copy of the webinar, and that will have information about the slides and, again, the corresponding URLs. I'm going to be offering a free 4-week online grief group on Thursdays at 4 p.m. This group will begin next week, Thursday, April 30th. The group is for anyone who has experienced a loss during COVID-19, and we will dive deeper into the strategies to cope with traumatic grief that I presented to you today. Please email info@FromGriefToGrowth to reserve your space in this group. I also encourage you to visit my website, From Grief to Growth, where you can access previous webinars that I've conducted and download a free ebook with 25 tips for surviving traumatic grief. I want to end today with my favorite grief quote. You may be familiar with it. Grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corner of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. And it hurts so much because you loved so fiercely. Okay, so that marks the end of my formal comments. And now I'm going to stop the webinar slides and turn the video back on. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A. If you have to leave the webinar, you're welcome to email me directly at fromgrief2growth.com. For those of you choosing to exit at this time, I want to thank you for participating today and wish you well on your grief journey. So let me turn the video back on. Let me stop the slide sharing, and I should be good to go. Are there any questions or any concerns that I can answer? Oh, here's one. What are some of the common treatments for traumatic grief? Great question. So the issues that I talked about today related to traumatic grief, many of the strategies for healing will help with that. For individuals who need more help, they can pursue individual therapy, group therapy, also EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing Therapy, is a great way to help people who are experiencing trauma, along with CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Also, having a strong routine and structure is a great way to help someone who has just experienced a trauma. The next question, what are signs of traumatic grief? I went over this a bit in the webinar, but just again, it's having experiences of hypervigilance, being constantly aware or alert. Some people refer to this as waiting for the other shoe to drop. Also, rumination, which is where you're reliving the details over and over of something traumatic that happened at the end of life or that was associated with the person's death. You're also welcome to look up symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which will also talk about some of the symptoms that are very similar in post-traumatic, in the grief that you're experiencing during traumatic grief. Can I recommend resources or therapists that specialize in EMDR or CBT? Absolutely. I'd ask that you email me separately. Let me know of the insurance status and where you're living, and I'm happy to send that information to you. Okay, and then the last question is, what should I recommend to my survivor clients about all the COVID news on TV? Great question. Take or go on a media diet. I'm not recommending that you have people put their head in the sand, but some people are spending a lot of time reading all of the news, watching TV about what's going on with COVID. And as a result, it's increasing their fears and it's increasing their anxiety tremendously, and they're having difficulty dealing with it. Also, I recommend that you have people remember of all the things that they're doing to keep themselves safe during COVID-19, the precautions that they're taking, the shelter in place. Remind them of the actions they can control and not focus as much on the ones that they cannot control. I think that about covers any questions. Again, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I welcome you to reach out at any time if I can provide some additional guidance or individual references or support. Again, thank you to everyone and be safe. Take care.